Oh, here we go. All right. Today we're joined by Eugene Theodore, master storyteller, strategic advisor, and founder of Saga Squared, and Alex Fellman, founder of Exponential U, VC fund advisor, and startup incubator director. Together, they'll challenge the assumptions underpinning modern capitalism and explore how community, consequence, and long-term trust can reshape value creation across startups, legacy business, and global institutions. Eugene and Alex, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Robin, for the introduction. My name is Eugene. I'm an ex-journalist, corporate brand builder, innovator, VC advisor. What it all comes down to is storytelling. And the way that we use storytelling is it's a holistic way of building a business and looking to make sure that both strategy and execution are aligned, but with the ultimate goal to serve the chosen communities with sustainability and significance. And with that, I'll pass it over to Alex to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex. I do a number of different things, but I'll try to keep my introduction short. One of the things, I work on the investment side. My family has a family office. We also advise family offices around the globe. In particular, my role is, I really see my role as to kind of help family invest in innovative technologies as a way to help them with generational wealth. In addition to that, I'm leading up a investment and wealth education platform called Exponential U, really designed to help high net worth individuals and family offices become multi-generationally sustainable.
Let's dive right in. We don't have all the time to handle what the World Economic Forum hasn't been able to do in the last 50 years. But I think before we go anywhere, we need to establish a baseline for what capitalism is, right? I was always exposed to capitalism either as a consumer, the end result of different forces coming to us, but I was also on the creation side, creating products and services, which ultimately through competition, innovation, or a mixture of the two, created a better product, a better service to be used by customers and users. Where the dichotomy starts to come in is where does that product or service or other ecosystems that these things start to touch start helping the consumer, the customer, the end user community, and when they start to harm them. I'd be interested to see how you've seen that dichotomy.
Yeah, I want to establish a different definition of capitalism. I think it's become a loaded term, and people are using it to mean all kinds of things to kind of push whatever kind of agendas that they want. But I want to kind of break it back to its core. At its core, capitalism is essentially an incentive system. Any economic system is basically an incentive system. It's a way that we can reward actions within society. We'll see what kind of outcomes. Whatever you reward is the outcomes you get. This is a kind of a Charlie Munger quote. Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, which is a really great one. What capitalism basically says is if you go out and solve the problems of the world, you will be rewarded greatly for it. If you think of what that means on a practical point of view, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an innovator, you will be rewarded for the fruits of your labor because ultimately by solving these problems, you're making the world a better place for the rest of society. If you really look at what has happened since the invention of capitalism, we've had an unbelievable amount of progress. I think it is connected to this idea of incentivizing people to go out, look at the world, and solve problems. You talked about this from the product side, and let's say taking a step back and looking at it from a higher level. What you started to question is what are the cracks in the system? I have created a mental model of the hero's journey. And if you look at the evolution of the hero over time, you get the cycle of hero fights dragon, hero gets rewarded. So that's the beginning of capitalism, as well as the entrepreneurial journey. Hero becomes wise king eventually becomes a king. And I believe kind of as part of the capitalist system, because we're rewarding the hero journey so much, we are also decreasing the time a hero spends in the wise king moment and becomes a tyrant king. I think having so many resources at a stage pushes people into becoming tyrants faster, becoming more exploitive, becoming more defensive with the resources they have. This is the problem with capitalism as we're looking at it today. I see this as kind of a corporatist capitalism or tyrannical capitalism. It's built into the system because it's a consequence of the way the system is designed. A good example would be a combustion engine. The whole point of a combustion engine is to take carbon, basically make a small explosion, turn that into energy to make things go. However, the offshoot is an exhaust pipe that brings CO2 into the atmosphere, very poisonous chemicals. Now, would you say that exhaust pipe is a feature, not a bug? It's kind of hard to say, but it's a consequence of the fact that you are blowing up carbon to create energy. And this is the same type of deal. The main goal of capitalism is to incentivize people to solve problems of the world, to fight dragons, get the treasure. That's the real goal of capitalism. However, there's sort of this exhaust pipe of the consequences of this is that they actually now go from being a hero to a tyrant relatively quickly. And I think that's the thing we need to figure out a way to solve.
As a storyteller, I love the allegory of linking this to the hero's journey. The issue is that the hero's journey always seems to have a very nice, happy ending. And as you mentioned, there's a hero, they need to help their community, they slay a dragon, and they get rewarded at the end for saving their community. The story always seems to end there. What, in your view, is missing from the storytelling point of view, from movies and pop culture? Everything ends with the ruler riding off into the sunset and everybody is merrily and happily cheering them and praising them. So where's the gap? What happens and why does it happen?
I think that's not necessarily true, especially if you look at sort of like the old Greek and Roman stories, right? They would start to play these stories out over time, and you would start to get in these cycles. The Oedipus story is an example of this. It turned out his dad was the tyrant. He took over his dad, but then he became a tyrant over time. The thing that's quite interesting is, like, naturally over time, if nothing else, because people age out of the given moment, at some point, the hero of a generation ages out. And when they're no longer part of the current generation, their values are no longer aligned with the current values. There's a saying that you either die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. I think this is sort of the sense of that. They found that if you look at social issues for the last 100 more years, progressive social issues have always won out over time. It's, in essence, conservative issues have never kind of been the one, except in very, very rare instances, maybe, for example, something like Iran, who had very progressive issues up into a point and then really, really had a counter-conservative movement. But in most Western countries, the progressive side has won over time. And it's usually been the type of thing where I would argue the thing that has prevented that has just been the aging out of the population who believe the old ways. And so I think this ties in nicely. We were talking offline, and one of the things we said about was something like Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola existed, the main problem they were trying to solve related to thirst. There was a long time where we couldn't drink water. People were drinking beer because it was safer than water. They needed an alternative where you're not getting drunk all the time, but you still need a way to thirst your quench, and it still needs to be healthy, or let's say, it won't make you sick. And so they solved that problem. However, let's say, over time, once they solved that problem, there are sort of new problems that the world deemed important that the Coca-Cola company were not part of. Or, for example, just if you look at something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is once you solve these baseline needs of thirst, you can start to move up the hierarchy, and other things start to become important, like pollution, right? And then the health of the environment. They're just like, oh, we want to make it easy to solve the thirst of people around the world. We want to put things into bottles, and that's an easy way to transport things and hold things. And because that's what they were solving, that's what they focused on. But then over time, as society changed and those needs got solved, new problems came up, like plastic doesn't disappear. That means it's destroying the environment. And now this kind of, you could potentially call it a side consequence or ripple effect, or potentially you could even call it an externality, is now a part of, let's say, the negative consequences of a company like Coca-Cola, as an example. Right? And I think that's one of these. Go ahead, jump in.
Oh, you brought up a few points. One of them, for example, being the aging out of the hero, or them becoming less and less in touch with the environment around them. If we impose that over the Maslow hierarchy of needs, the only way I would see that happening, which I don't understand why it would, is if the hero solves the problem, quenches thirst, but then literally goes blind and doesn't see what else is happening around, and therefore doesn't continue to move up the pyramid or continue solving the other problems that it becomes aware of. I can't imagine that any company, especially 100-year-old companies, or even companies that are less than 10 years old but are multi-billion-dollar companies, somehow cannot be aware of additional problems that either they've created by solving the first, or they become aware of, or they become contributory to by solving the first. So how is it that the hero ages out without doing anything, without seeing anything and acting on it?
I think most companies come to a thing where they get into the, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail type of tunnel vision, right? Let's say Coca-Cola, if we're using this example, is used to solving thirst problems and used to looking through the world through thirst problems. And so if they're looking through the world through thirst problems, to them, everything is a thirst problem, right? They get very tunnel vision. And I think this is just naturally something that happens not just to companies, but to anything over time. You exercise a specific frame of reference point of view. So that becomes your main point of view at the cost of any other potential ones. Some people could call this an innovator's dilemma, but it's essentially hard to teach old dogs new tricks. They're looking at everything as if it's a nail and they're this hammer. And then at some point they're so entrenched in a certain way of doing things, it becomes difficult to teach old dogs new tricks. This thing maps to how individuals age. It's the same thing that happens to human beings as they develop. They become less open, more focused on the habits that they're used to, and that kind of puts them almost blind to the other things going on around them. And this is something that, tying back to a mythological thing, taps into the story of Osiris. There's a famous Egyptian story where he was the elder god and ended up going blind. He needed his children to get his sight back, summarizing that story very briefly. It's a natural progress of age. I think the same thing happens at organizations that happens with individuals.
I'm wondering if we bring it back to what you said before, which is, let's say, capitalism is perhaps one of the best incentive structures that have propelled humanity forward, whether it's been through economics, through technology, through exploration. Isn't there still a continued incentive to the existing capitalist construct to not be tunnel vision, to say, yes, I've conquered thirst, I've conquered combustion, I've conquered whatever, but there's bigger dragons out there. Now that I have the capabilities, the knowledge, the scale, the impact, I can, even if it's for my own personal glory, I can do something about that now, and I should and will go out and do something about that.
I see what you're getting at, and I think there are some people who are able to maintain the drive and ambition, but I think just naturally over time, once you've been rewarded and rewarded extremely handsomely, fighting dragons is extremely difficult. And so I think if you've already been rewarded, the desire to continue to fight dragons significantly decreases. I think what a lot of them end up doing is, instead of trying to fight for new pots of gold, they try to become more defensive around their various positions, because it's easier to squeeze more juice out of lemons you already have compared to trying to get new lemons. And also, like, to a certain extent, right, I mentioned this before, the innovator's dilemma, right, down to, do we kind of squeeze our cash cow for as much resources as we can get out of it, or do we try to innovate and find something completely new that we don't know will work? Do we go fight a new dragon, even though we're not sure we're going to go and defeat this dragon, right? There's an inherent risk of fighting dragons, right? You could argue there's maybe an existential risk, at least in the short term, right? If I have my pile of gold, I'm trying to get more out of that, building castles, safes to make it so I don't squander the gold that I have, is much easier than fighting new dragons. I think that's what happens. A good example will be, you'll see this in tech a lot, where Mark Zuckerberg had the great quote that we should go fast and break things. But then what tends to happen is that once they've gone fast, break things, and become successful, they then push the government to make regulations so other people can't go fast and break things in the way that they did. It's something, you're seeing this play out right now in AI, and you're seeing people like Sam Altman push for regulations on AI that, if in place, would prevent them from having the success that they had.
So if I summarize this, we're basically saying that capitalism is an amazing incentive structure, but only to the point where you get to your pot of gold as quickly or efficiently as possible. Once you get it, you're very happy to safeguard it, and you might even undermine other people's chances of getting their own.
I would argue it is such a good incentive system that it actually pushes people more towards safeguarding and trying to prevent others from getting their own, pushes people to ways to be more preservation, to be more extractive, to prevent other players in the game. That's one of the things that's really interesting from a competition point of view. Usually when regulations come along, markets become less competitive, and it becomes much harder for new entrants to enter markets. Essentially, in one way of what regulations does is it increases the barrier of what's necessary to be able to enter the market, which makes it easier for
incumbents
to continue to persist in their positions. Very often in new markets, they'll push for deregulation early, and then at some point they'll swap once they feel like they're in a, let's say, secure enough position, and then they want to use that as a way to arguably keep their lead in a space. I would argue that transition to becoming a tyrant king, sort of in the mythological point, right? If you're actively trying to prevent other people from making your industry better, you're a tyrant, like on some level.
So let's take this out of the myth zone for a moment. In the real world, the incumbents, right? We have the Coca-Colas, the Exxons, massive companies, Metas. You and I operate in a world teeming with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of startups, small businesses, entrepreneurs, backers, investors, VC funds, private equity funds. Theoretically, there should be some kind of better balance achieved between the incumbents, who they're no longer moving fast and breaking things because they're trying to preserve themselves, and this whole army of everyone else who see current problems, maybe are forecasting future problems, and are working together to solve them. Let's say, force the incumbents to improve or dethrone them with a better solution. Isn't that the counterbalance that's needed, and is it working?
I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a counterbalance, but this is one of the interesting things about capitalism. It has a built-in system of itself to perpetuate progress, right? Let's say the heroes today become the tyrants that future heroes can overcome and overthrow, which creates this kind of perpetual motion in the system. And so that is something that is certainly very, very true, is that there's kind of this natural, let's say, because of the natural incentives in the system, more people will try to attack legacy and tyrannical systems within capitalism. But the question becomes, will the incumbents become too large so that no matter what happens, they are too big to fail within a given market? Let's look at something like the banking sector. We could argue that turn of the century, the banking system has been tyrannical. If you look at the 2008 financial crisis and whatnot, have shown that they are doing things that are not in the best interest of the consumer and society at large. However, under normal circumstances, because they got caught for what happened, that should have got them booted from the system for a number of different reasons. They have not, and realistically, no one got punished for what they did, which was an obvious crime. And I think if you look at what's happening in places like the US, there haven't really been any real challengers to this system. But if you look at places like Europe, there's been a number of neobanks created that have been challengers. The other thing, I would argue that the whole crypto and blockchain movement is essentially an attempt to overthrow the tyrannical banking industry. If you look at when it kind of, both neobanks and blockchain started right after the 2008 financial crisis. Both of them sort of saw like, hey, this is a tyrannical system. It's not working. We want to counter it. But unfortunately, at least in the US, yes, crypto has kind of gotten a hold, but neobanks have not. I think the sign that neobanks have not been able to really take off in the US and create a competitor to the more traditional banks shows that if these companies become too entrenched, it becomes very difficult or impossible for new players come in and throw them out, regardless of how they're doing. Or I'll give you a basic example with some of the banks that I deal with. I'm an American living in Europe. A lot of US banks have a practice where they will charge extra fees to their customers, knowing that not all their customers will fight the fees or leave. They know they can make a profit on these unwarranted fees because enough people won't push back against them. And let's say, even if it's, 20%, that means they're getting this extra, whatever that is, on revenue per year. That's kind of a practice. Let's say in places like Europe, there are alternatives, but in the US, there's not really real neobanks that have taken off. The system is more entrenched.
It sounds that either the system in itself, as you've been saying, has been built to be one of attrition, right? There's this natural cycle where heroes go up the mountain, become kings, start kicking things out, destroying things, and new heroes emerge to sort of try and change it. But there's this constant turnover, which to me doesn't necessarily sound at the macro level that it would push for a positive shift, because a lot of energy and resources are being wasted to dethrone and rethrone different entities, companies, people. Since capitalism has been hailed, even to Nobel Peace and economics levels, as something which has elevated communities out of poverty, brought forward mass education, obviously fueled technology and leaps in progress. To me, that side of capitalism sounds like it was forged with the community in mind and not any single individual. But yes, maybe there's a single actor doing something, but the ripple effects are meant to touch positively the lives of everyone around them. So where has that element gone is the next question.
I don't think that element has necessarily gone anywhere. What I do think has happened is somewhere around the 1970s, 1980s, we have created a version of capitalism that is essentially only focused on the financial reward part and is optimizing for the financial reward part. And yes, at the entrepreneurial level, there are many entrepreneurs trying to solve various problems in society. But I think you're right to the point where many of them are being forced to take on incumbents and resolve old problems incumbents have solved the problem in a certain way, but now they've created a system that has new problems in it. So we're basically solving like a new version of an old problem instead of new problems. At least in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong. I would rather humanity was ever expanding in solving new problems that would overall make us better. I believe the balance between fixing broken, I would rather we lived in a society where we spent more time fixing things out there in the world that need to be fixed compared to fixing things because people have created bad systems.
There's a financial incentive to continue fixing them as opposed to new ones.
Certainly we want both to happen, right? But I think we've gotten to a place where unfortunately we're spending a lot of time fixing broken systems, right? And there's a lot of energy going into fixing broken systems that have been created. And certainly, yes, we still want that to be incentivized, but we also want a system that is incentivized. We were talking about this today. Delta and United have a system now where they are charging people for window seats. Some people could see extra value in window seats, fine. But what they started to go wrong is some of the seats they were calling window seats were actually walls. If you paid extra for it, you actually got a wall, which wasn't a window seat. Now someone is spending time to fight these airlines because they were sold a window seat that wasn't a window seat. To me, that seems like a waste of time, energy, effort, attention to be fighting. Like, because they're doing it, we kind of need to fight it. I'm not saying just look the other way on problems as they happen. What I am saying is it would be really good if we didn't have to like fight airlines to like sell things that aren't actually there. Because essentially what they're doing is arguably fraud. We're going to sell you a window seat, but that window seat doesn't actually exist. That's basically fraud. They're selling something that doesn't exist or isn't real. They're false advertising. That's fraud.
So I'm going to put my ultra cynical and pessimist hat on, which is usually on anyway, and say everything we've been talking about, the system is rigged to a certain extent. For those that make it through, they get disproportionately rewarded. They then become defensive. They then become extractive. They then obviously start influencing and changing things to protect their pot of gold, their kingdom, their throne. That does give rise to new heroes from a natural progression point of view. Either changing the system or solving new problems diminishes over time. So in this world of dismal futurism, where are the intervention points? Is it at a systems level? Is it at an actor level? Is there something that we can harness that already exists, or do we need to build something completely new, tear down the old structures and educate people on new ones?
I think with things like this, it's a multi-pronged approach. For me, the really big thing would be to establish communities of entrepreneurs who, let's say, become self-aware that over time, we might become the problems. So we need to be proactive, ensuring that we don't become tyrannical, that we keep each other in check, that we take feedback from our environment, communities, society to do better, that we start to look at, let's say, problems of our industry and see ways that we can potentially work together, not hoard these systemic issues within a certain industry or space for economic gain or leverage over our competitors, but actually use it as a way to lift all boats. And I think that's one of the things a lot of people need to get in the mindset of, right? If we grow the pie bigger for everybody, everybody benefits. For entrepreneurs, they're kind of the heroes in the situation. That's a way they naturally think. Let's solve this problem, let's grow this pie. But at some point, at that scale, that mindset switches over time. New ways of thinking tend to win out. And so I would take an approach of like, hey, entrepreneurs, let's get together. Let's actively try to prevent ourselves and create a community where we promote not trying to trade this way of thinking. I do think some of that is happening, and you're seeing groups of that. And I think you're even seeing that on the private wealth side. I think younger and new wealth is being more purpose-driven and intentional with where they're making investments. They're also choosing not to invest in companies that are more on the traditional VC and venture route, going for companies that are more sustainable in the sense of trying to build businesses that will last hundreds of years. Whereas if you look at what your typical VC business is, it's kind of hot, quick rise, quick fall. There was someone, I forgot where this came from, but they said, in essence, the time it takes for you to rise is equal to the time it takes for you to fall. So every company kind of looks like a parabola, in essence, so you can kind of get a sense of how long these companies last. When you see that, I don't know, a good example would be something like Week, for example, would be a really good example of something that rose quickly and then crashed just as quickly. I think you'll see that play out in a number of ways.
So you hinted to a few new areas, and I think I'll address the first one first. Is it inevitable, even with a community aspect, even with that self-awareness, that the hero who becomes a wise ruler will inevitably become a tyrant?
My personal opinion is yes, but I think how would I put this? We talked a little bit about this. You can manage the effects of how tyrannical they can be. A different way of thinking about this would be something like when people get old, you have the old man on his porch yelling at crowds or screaming at young people. That's all a form of tyranny, but it's also a form that, on the whole, doesn't really affect much. You can probably see that in different industries where older veterans will be like, oh, back in my day, blah, 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 whatever. And maybe ad men go, back in my day, we used to have the martini lunches and we can't do that anymore. That's a tyrannical way of thinking. The way we used to do things is the way we should be doing things, even though the world has moved forward. Right? And I personally believe that everyone and every company will get there at some point. The question becomes, when you get to that point, what do you do? Using Mad Men example, do you force martini lunches on people? Or do you just kind of like, things were better in the old days, but I'm not in charge anymore, so what are you going to do about it?
I'll play devil's advocate. The point of having the veteran, the one who remembers that far back, is that they're probably one of the few people in a business that has that longevity, that they hold the culture of the business, of the brand. They obviously have the operational memory so that people don't continue making the same mistakes because they already made them and moved past them. They still have quite a lot of core value that they can continue to lend themselves to the business. So how do we balance it in the admin space? I'm actually here to stop the new generation from screwing things up because they simply don't have the experience, the knowledge, the skills.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the things that we're actually struggling with, a conversation that's larger than just capitalism. This is a bigger societal problem where we've moved away for roles for older people within society. And historically, in most societies, what we've done with kind of older people is we put them into mentorship, coaching, wise elders, shamans of the society. And if you think of almost what you described, what is the point of those people in society? It's basically to transmit knowledge between generations to help kind of, let's say, the way that I like to think about it is, I think one of the great things about wisdom or experience is if you're around long enough, you'll realize that some things change and some things don't. And so I think some of the great balance for older generations and younger generations is younger generations can tell you, here's the things that have changed. And older generations can tell you, here's the things that have not. Let's say things about, let's say, human nature, or, there's a number of things that aren't going to change over time almost no matter what, take really long times to change. And then they can tell you like, oh, this particular thing, probably a fad because of XYZ or not, but they kind of can help you tell you that because they've seen, let's say, many things come and go, like a Lindy effect. I don't know if you're familiar with the Lindy effect. The Lindy effect is the longer something exists, the more likely it will continue to exist. It shows robustness if it's able to continue to survive. Older people will have a better sense of what things have the Lindy effect, right? What things are robust, what things tend to be able to continue to exist within whatever changes are happening around them. I think that is one of the things that's happening now is we've removed a lot of those roles in society. On a different level, I think that's actually making a lot of people become tyrannical. If you don't have this esteemed, respected role to go into as an elder, then you're going to hold on to the role that you have more tightly. And the more tightly you're going to hold on to something, the more likely you're going to become a tyrant. Right? And I think that's one of the things you're seeing in politicians, at least in the United States. You're seeing politicians die in office in their 90s. That's something that fundamentally shouldn't be going on. The average age of CEOs is rising, which suggests they're holding on to these areas of power and status longer. I would argue that that is not necessarily because they're needed. I think more of a status and ego thing, wanting to hold on to this role in society for longer.
And to bring it back to the old man on the porch idea, hanging on for longer, but becoming increasingly disconnected.
Absolutely. I think they're getting increasingly disconnected, but I think also you're seeing not just, how would I put this? I think that's also connected to the size of the reward part of the equation. Because of how much they're rewarded, they're able to almost put themselves in ivory towers. By putting themselves in ivory towers, not only are they disconnected within organizations, but they become increasingly disconnected from society. And then the Bill Gates, what's the cost of a loaf of bread, a banana meme, right? Stuff like that, right? Where they're fundamentally out of touch with what's going on with the rest of society.
So now that we've thoroughly depressed everyone, it would be nice if there was some light at the end of the tunnel vision that we mentioned before. It's an interesting metaphor of this hero's journey. There's the hero, there's the problem, it gets solved, they get disproportionately rewarded, and they become a wise ruler, or at least the efficient person with that knowledge base to continue solving the problem and educate their community around solving that problem. The linchpin of this is what happens next, how quickly, and with what help or systems. How can we increase the gap between the wise ruler becoming a tyrannical ruler? Because it seems inevitable eventually, even just through simple aging, that will happen. There will be a level of disconnect to some point. So how do we improve it? The more interesting question is, what is the kind of succession planning that's needed and who can influence that? Because even with your CEO example, people in power do not tend to relinquish it easily, or at least not willingly. So what is the incentive for them to move on and join this mentoring council of elders that they're still around, they're still involved, but they pass on the knowledge and they pass on the opportunities to the next generation?
I personally think it starts with the current generation. So let's say that the current generation of entrepreneurs and heroes can do this for themselves. And to be optimistic, they found that for any social movement, it doesn't matter what it is, if you can get 10% of the population on that side of a question, a problem, then it will the entire conversation in that direction. So I believe if entrepreneurs starting from the beginning, moving in this direction, and they internally start to do things, I think a good point that we haven't really touched on, as a form of transition, apprenticing people to be their successors, coming in and going, hey, I'm going to train someone from subsequent generation to take over. And sort of, I'm going to create a system that, in essence, I'm going to make myself obsolete before I can become a tyrant, or minimizes the consequences of me becoming a tyrant because someone else has replaced my role and position within these organizations. I think if you get enough companies doing that, you could probably do this within 5 to 10 years, companies start doing that for themselves, then I think inevitably that will shift the conversation and will start to force other companies to act in a similar manner. That's how I see the way to go about this. Operate like this for yourself first. Get a community of people who think similar to yourself. Get enough people to do that together and you get a movement. Once you get a movement going, and if you have enough critical mass, that movement starts to dictate how society works.
I'll bring it back to where entrepreneurship crosses private wealth or investment. The future Coca-Colas of tomorrow are starting from someone's garage today. We are in the middle of one of the biggest wealth transfer moments of human history. All the people 100 years ago who built their empires, they're being passed on to their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And if they're not passing on businesses that they've built, they're passing on wealth, which is invested in these longer-term legacy businesses. So what needs to happen? What conversations need to happen, or what beliefs need to be transmitted so that when that transfer happens, it's not just a repeat of the existing, as you put it before, financially incentivized capital system, but a more community-oriented incentive system?
I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to try to keep this relatively short, but this is something I'm seeing, at least coming out of the family office private wealth space. I think there's a whole side of the family office private wealth space that is not only optimizing for financial return, they're also optimizing for what I tend to call emotional value. In essence, and I think this is increasing as we're getting the wealth transfer and as new family offices are being created. Most new family offices are being created by tech founders, and many of them are trying to solve or optimize for something beyond financial. They have some kind of cause or idea, but I think they have some kind of cause they really care about, and they're going to try to optimize for that cause. Let's say the family really cares about curing cancer. They really want to cure cancer. Great. So the metrics they're optimizing for is, can our investments push the industry of curing cancer farther so that people are dying of cancer? That's kind of the way they're looking at it. And then sure, it is an investment, so they want to make their money back and so on and so forth, but they're optimizing across multiple variables in terms of return on investment. I do think there is a lot of thought process here. If we solve problems that are either very large or occur for many people, then we will probably make money, right? Because inevitably, and again, looping back to our hero journey, in general, the idea is you get rewarded based on the size or the amount of dragons you slay. That is kind of at its core of something like capitalism. And I think to a certain extent, you're having more people that are kind of almost looking at it at process first as, hey, we want to solve something either very, very big or for a lot of people. And we will be financially rewarded because that's essentially how capitalism works. Be financially rewarded for doing that, compared to let's find the way that we'll be financially rewarded. We'll care less about how that happens.
We won't put a clock on it. Coming from the corporate side, it's a quarter to quarter lifespan, right? Even CEOs, even if they're lasting longer, they're literally looking, what dividends am I going to produce this quarter? And they're supposedly building innovation, which should last for 5 to 10 years, but they will quickly abandon it if this quarter there's some issue. Is it fair to say that the time horizon, yes, there's a financial incentive that's being looked at. There are other metrics, KPIs potentially, that are being looked at, but it's also the fact that the time limit or the time that's usually imposed on when I need to get the investment, how the rate of return, et cetera, these are being mitigated or transformed into new kinds of criteria.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. I do think that's one of the things I personally like about private wealth versus institutional investing. In a lot of ways, private wealth can look at their wealth as an infinite game, whereas institutional wealth very much see it as like a finite game. And in many situations, the corporate's looking quarter to quarter, but even a VC fund, they need an exit within 10 years, no matter what. And that often will lead towards a couple different things. One, kind of mismanagement of companies themselves. I think one of the things you're trying to see is a counter movement against VC within the startup ecosystem, basically because they realized that the VC model was incentivizing companies towards strategies that were not in line with what they wanted to achieve and the outcomes they were aiming for. And so now there's becoming alternative pathways to build companies. And I think more companies are choosing that pathway unless they believe the VC route makes sense for them, right? So some people are still being like, that's the direction I want to go. I believe we can rocket ship within this amount of time. Great. They're choosing that. But many entrepreneurs are being like, that doesn't really make sense for me at all. And now they're seeing more options to do it differently. I do think one of the things excited and optimistic is that increasingly we're having tools that are being produced extremely cheaply. If you look at kind of AI, vibe coding, all these things, that the cost of actually creating companies is decreasing extremely rapidly. And that's democratizing both access to the ability to create companies, but also the ability to create companies in the way that you want. I saw an email recently that was talking about a venture studio that developed something that in the past would have taken 40 employees that they can now do with 4. And that just opens up all kinds of optionality for those 4 founders that wouldn't have existed in the past. And I forget what they were saying, but in the general scheme of things, not costing them all that much money. I think it was costing them maybe $20K a month or something, which would be way less than the cost of 40 employees on a monthly basis. So that's allowing them to make different choices.
It also means they don't have to sell themselves to a kind of investor in order to get the 40 employees and then get pigeonholed into whatever those metrics are needed. So since we are coming to a close, I will try and do a brief recap. I'll use our hero's journey allegory to see if we can inspire the next round of heroes. The idea is you start from your community. You identify the dragon, the problem that you need to solve. There are multiple incentives to do so, financial being one of them, but there are others which are just as, if not more important. Once you're able to do so, which you can do so now, usually for cheaper, for less energy, or less employees, etc., you will get to that status of a wise ruler, someone who has that knowledge base and over time consolidates that knowledge base. But the important thing is not to hoard it, but to start sharing it. Not just with the next generation, your successor, whether it's an apprentice, whether it's, your own family, but even within your community or your competitive community. At the end of the day, you will each have your own way of slaying your own dragon. At the meta level, one level up, you will all have that set of problems which are bigger than you, which you all need to address and which you can address better by working together. That might delay your transition into becoming a tyrannical ruler and self-serving. But even if you do one day become that, you've built a system and trained and inspired the next round of heroes to come in after you and maintain what you've done, improve what you've done, and continue serving the community that you came from. So if I've left anything out, Alex can jump right in. But
no, I think that's a good place to close today's session. I'm just seeing something drop in chat. Yeah.
About social entrepreneurship.
Victor was asking, do you know of any groups that are working on practical solutions to drive this type of change? I think there's a number of different communities out there that maybe they're not necessarily trying to drive this type of change specifically, but I think they're creating communities of entrepreneurs that are like-minded in this direction. I know various groups more in the biotech space that I would recommend. A group in Denmark is called Rebels. There's a group here in Latvia called Biocatalyst. They're kind of, I would say, like-minded, working in those industries. I'm talking to a number of people in the family office private wealth space that are kind of rethinking, what does this mean? How can we do better? That's happening not through official communities. It's kind of self-aggregating groups of people, small WhatsApp groups and the like. Kind of there becomes these conversations.
It's micro communities that are that are either gathering around industries or causes.
Yeah.
With that, I think we'll pass it back to Robin to close us out. We thank you very much for your time and interest.
Thank you so much, Eugene and Alex, for sharing these valuable insights and also challenge us to think differently about the future of business and community. Thank you, everyone that joined us today, and we hope you all leave with fresh perspectives that you can bring back to your work. And with that, see you all at Davos Summit 2026. Have a nice week, everyone.
Bye, everybody.